ridden a lot of bike parts, and a lot of bikes, and I've done a lot of bike-related stuff. And today I want to talk about some of the most overrated bike parts and bike-related things, and actually maybe a few underrated as well. So let's get started.
Howdy everybody. VanCan, or Nic Zilinski, is a YouTuber with a pretty big following, and he's a pretty talented rider. And he posted a video not too long ago called Overrated Bike Parts. Now, he's talking about little bits of hardware that are overrated or underrated, or that he agrees or disagrees with. And I found it a very interesting watch. So I suggest you go over and watch it. I'll put a link down below. But I also thought I'd post a couple of rebuttals to the things that he was saying, because it's not necessarily that I disagree with him, and it's not that I don't think anybody has a right to their opinion. They do. It's that I have my own take on a lot of stuff, because I've been riding for a while, and I thought it was a really interesting piece, so here we go. The first item on Nic's list is carbon frames. Now, carbon frames are everywhere. There's no denying it. They are what modern mountain bikes are built out of. Does that make them the necessary material to use? Of course not. There are a lot of other legitimate materials, among which are aluminum, which he states is kind of his favorite. Also steel, and also titanium. And I've seen bikes made out of wood that I would never ride down a mountain, and other materials, bamboo, things like that. You could go a lot of different directions, but really the three biggies are steel, titanium, aluminum, and then of course carbon. So what does that mean? Well, I've been riding bikes for a very long time, and when I was growing up, all the bikes were made out of steel. It was cheap, it was easy, and you could really get a steel bike for pennies on the dollar compared to what you pay for bikes today. I've also owned aluminum frames, and I've ridden titanium frames, but I've never owned one. You know, if they're built right, they can be very nice. Steel frames are fairly easy to manufacture. I do own a couple of steel bikes now, and they're both hand-built frames. My mountain bike, my very first nice mountain bike, is a Bontrager Racelite. In fact, it's the last one that was ever built in the Bontrager factory in Santa Cruz, California, back in the 90s, before they were bought out by Trek. Bontrager used to be a frame builder. Keith Bontrager pioneered frame building and frame building practices, and really kind of wrote the book on modern steel frame building. And in fact, a lot of his designs have been carried over into aluminum building as well. I can't really speak for titanium, I don't know a whole lot about it. But my Bontrager is a sweet bike. It was really one of the best frames you could get when I bought it back in the 90s. And I outfitted it with some pretty decent components, and I did a lot of racing on it. Never did very well, but I had a great time. And it was really nice to have a nice bike after all the mediocre and entry-level bikes I've been riding for so many decades before that. I still have that bike. It's out in my garage, and it's still a great bike. It still runs. It's a very different beast from the kind of things that you go out and purchase these days. It's got a different geometry. It's got the smaller wheels. It doesn't have as many speeds. It can't handle a long travel fork. It doesn't have disc brakes. You know, it's an old school bike, but it still works great as kind of a beer run machine, or if I want to ride my bike downtown and get a pint with a friend and then ride home. But it's not a modern bike. So, you know, it misses out on a lot of the things that modern bikes can do, like full suspension, like longer wheelbases, larger wheel sizes, you know, boost. Doesn't have anything like that. So, but honestly, it was a great bike for its age, and it still runs great. In fact, I rode it right up until I bought my 2016 Santa Cruz Bronson, which was my first modern mountain bike. And I rode it on everything. I took it on giant fast downhills, and I was always wondering why all my friends were going so much faster than I was. But it was because, you know, they're more modern bikes. But that steel frame did me good. In fact, it did so good by me that when my Kestrel EMS 200 finally died, I rode the hell out of that thing, put thousands and thousands of miles on it. I brought my Kestrel over to Paul Sadoff at Rock Lobster Bicycles in Santa Cruz, and I showed him the frame and I said, can you make this out of steel? I love the geometry, it's perfect for me. Can you just build the same bike but out of steel? And he said, absolutely. And he did. And my road bike out in the garage is a steel frame, hand-built Rock Lobster that was built by Paul. Great frame builder, probably one of the best in the world. and he actually used to work for Bontrager for a while at least. And it is a fantastic, responsive, stiff, beautiful bike. Once again, it's not particularly modern. I got it done right before the disc brake revolution happened on road bikes. So it doesn't have disc brakes, but everything else about it is pretty modern and it runs great. You know, I still ride it all the time. So is Carbon legitimate? Of course. It commands pioneering technologies and new frame designs in the industry every year. But is it more legitimate than aluminum? Of course not. Both are great. Ride what you love. Aluminum has a different vibration dampening capability than carbon does. Carbon can be stiffer if it's built differently, or it can be softer. And aluminum tends to have one kind of feel to it. It's very good at absorbing the high-speed chatter, but big hits, you know, you're gonna feel them on any frame, really. So aluminum's a great material. So is steel, so is titanium, and so is carbon. Number 2 on Nic's list is electronics, and he's pretty much referring to electronic shifting and RC, RF component operation. You know, things like Axis or Di2. And Shimano and SRAM dominate this market. They're the guys that are making the stuff that people buy. Is there other stuff? Yes, but I'm gonna kind of stick to Shimano and SRAM really for this video because they're the 2 big players. That doesn't degrade anybody else. There's a lot of legitimate options out there, but these are the big guys. Shimano never really hit it big with wireless shifting and electronic shifting. From what I understand, they have some stuff coming onto the market that's going to be pretty big, or is already pretty big. I haven't done my homework on that. I'm very familiar with the SRAM lineup, and I like it a lot. Is it necessary to have wireless or electronic shifting on a bike in order to make it a good bike? Of course not, but it sure helps. Now, I've been riding bikes for 35, 40 years. God, I hate to say that, but it's true. And I've been working on bikes for 2/3 of that. I've been working in bike shops pretty much ever since I was in high school. And mechanical, cable actuated drivetrains and brakes and all that stuff, you know, they've been really refined almost completely to perfection. They work incredibly well, and there's no denying that you can win a race on a cable actuated drivetrain. Like, they're great. I personally love the Axis model because, well, I'll just tell you a story. About 4 or 5 years ago, I was riding in North Carolina with a guy who's from Florida, another YouTuber. His name is Mr. Tonka. Great guy and really good rider. And he was the first guy that I'd ever seen who was running a full Axis setup. And I asked him, is it worth it? What do you think? And he said, oh my God, yes. He said, if you can, go out and get Axis. And that was a ringing endorsement. So I remembered that, and when I was building up my next bike, my Ibis Ripmo V2, I put Axis X01 on it. And you know what? I love it. It was great. It was responsive, it shifted fast, it shifted positively, never missed a shift, never missed a shift. It was very pretty, you know, I didn't have to run cables, there was a lot less work involved in getting it set up. And it paired to the phone very quickly and easily. Never had a single issue with that as well. I know others have, but I never had an issue pairing my Axis system to my iPhone. So when I built up my next bike, which was a Santa Cruz Highball, I put Axis on that as well. And then when I upgraded to my most recent bike, which is a Yeti SB150, I put Axis on that. And I even put it on my fat bike. So I'm running Axis GX, X01, and XX1 on 4 different bikes. And I'll tell you, it runs great on all 4 of them. It is reliable, and for all intensive purposes, it's perfect. Well, okay, it's not perfect. What are the drawbacks of electronic componentry? It runs on batteries. Batteries die. So I've never run out of batteries personally on the trail, but I'm kind of sticky about monitoring that sort of thing and making sure that they're all charged up and ready for the day. I might even overcharge them too often because I never really let them get below half. But they're easy to monitor on the iPhone app that I run, but also I just charge them every once in a while. I've never had an issue. I also carry a spare in my Camelback. So if one were to die, I can swap it out. And honestly, I've given it to other people that have had dead batteries in the past. I can swap a battery with somebody, no problem. I'm willing to lose that battery if I'm getting their spent one in exchange, and I can charge it up and use it as my spare. But batteries do die, and one thing I've noticed about the Axis batteries in particular is that when the bike is mounted on your rack and you're driving a long distance, and I'm talking a day or more of driving with your bike on the car, the bike's gonna rattle. And that rattling motion is picked up by the Axis system. And I believe, I could be mistaken about this, but it seems to me that it responds to it and tries to react to it. And that uses up the battery. So, for instance, when I drove out to North Carolina, I noticed when I got there that my battery was dead. Fortunately, I check that sort of thing when I get off the... Fortunately, I check that sort of thing as soon as I take the bike off the car. And the dead battery was charged and I was able to use it the next day. But it was dead. And so that's something to be aware of. If you're going to put your bike on a car and you're going to drive a long distance, take the battery off. Then you're fine. So, are there disadvantages to electronic componentry? Of course. Are there disadvantages to cable-driven componentry? Of course, you know. Cables stretch. They're a lot more work to run, especially if you have internal cable routing. So it all depends on where your sweet spot is and how much you're willing to spend. And I generally tell people, if you can afford it, go out and get Axis because you're gonna like it. It's a really well-built system, and I really only see it improving in the years ahead. So that's my 2 cents. 38mm forks. Now, I'll just try to make this quick. I have 2 enduro bikes, a Ibis Ripmo V2 and a Yeti SB150. The Ibis Ripmo came with a performance level 36mm stanchion tube fork that had 150-ish millimeters of travel. I'm a little off there, but it's pretty close. And my Yeti SB150 came with the Fox 38 Grip 2 fork, which is a beefier fork, and it's also the higher end fork with the Kashima coating and all that crap. And they both work beautifully. And I can ride the same trails on both, and I don't feel hindered or I don't feel like I'm benefiting from one over the other. They're both fantastic. Now, I have been riding that 36 on the Ibis Ripmo for a couple, 2.5 years, and I've really put it through the paces. I've ridden some pretty hardcore stuff in a lot of different states: Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, California, North Carolina, Colorado, Utah, you name it. I've brought that thing all over the place, and I put a lot of miles on it, and a lot of really brutal miles. And I've even crashed it a couple of times. And it has held up, but I'm sure that made it a little bit softer. So when I got the new Yeti SB150 with the 38, it felt stiffer. And you know what? I like that more. Does that make it better? Not necessarily. It's a matter of personal taste. But what I have a problem with is I'm not sure if I can attribute the stiffness to the fact that the 38 is a 38 or the fact that the 38 is newer. I'm sure that both play into that to some degree. I've rebuilt the 36 once over the years, and you know, it's performed well, but they do feel slightly different now. That being said, I can ride the same trails on both, and they both work beautifully. Now, I'm a pretty heavy rider. I think I'm heavier than Nick. I think he's taller than me, but I think I weigh more than him. Not really happy about that, but that's the way it is. And so these beefier forks, they really do come in handy. I have a heavy long travel Yeti and a heavy long travel Ibis, and they both have similar travel, and they both support me in very similar ways. In fact, the 2 bikes ride virtually identically, even with the different forks. So I can't say that there's a massive difference between the 2, and I can't necessarily recommend one over another. Perhaps if I was at a pro level, that might be different. My tastes might be refined enough and my needs might be refined enough to require one over the other. But from where I'm standing, they're both great. No complaints. Lightweight bikes. Okay, lightweight bikes. What are we talking about here? We're talking about bikes that are designed to be super light, and I guess that there's a pervasive attitude that comes at the cost of strength, which I disagree with. If anybody has seen some of the Santa Cruz frame testing videos where they put the frames through their paces and they're swinging these carbon frames against big cement blocks and they're not breaking, I'm convinced that carbon frames are ridiculously strong, or aluminum, or steel, or titanium. You know, we've had that discussion. But lightweight bikes don't necessarily sacrifice strength for weight gain or weight loss. I have a very, very light bike. I have a Santa Cruz Highball 2021 XX1 SID fork, lightweight, SID SL I think it is, and all the components on it are kind of designed to be really, really lightweight, and that thing screams. It is a great bike. It wasn't cheap, but it's really carved out its own niche. Where I would normally ride my local San Francisco Bay Area trails where I grew up on one of my 2 enduro bikes and have a great time doing it, if I take the Highball out on those same trails with its medium knobby cross-country tread, and its really, really steep head tube and its really, really steep steer tube, it just screams on those trails. There's almost no rolling resistance in comparison to the enduro bikes, and it climbs, like I like to say, like a mountain goat on cocaine. It just wants to go up that hill. It pulls me up the hill, it feels like. I feel like this is what it must feel like if you switch over to an e-bike. Like the benefit is noticeable, substantially noticeable. So riding a very light bike, you know, granted it has different geometry that's more designed for climbing, it's nice. And I would say that if you can afford it, you should do it, because man, it makes a difference. I was blowing all my PRs out of the water. All my PRs. I mean, I was doing some pretty good times. I wasn't setting any records, but I was doing some pretty good times on the enduro bikes and having a great time doing it. And then as soon as I got on that ultralight Santa Cruz Highball, it just put an end to all my PRs. It blew through everything, and I set all new personal records for everything. So it makes a big difference. Now, do you need one? Maybe, maybe not. If you race cross country, you might. But it makes a big difference, and it's nice to have that extra little arrow in my quiver, because it gives me more options, and it can make some of my riding days a lot more enjoyable. Hardtails. Okay, this kind of dovetails a little bit into the ultralight thing, because I do have a hardtail. My Santa Cruz Highball is a hardtail, and that's part of the reason it weighs 20 pounds. But it can do things that my enduro bikes can't do, like climbing. You know, it's a very maneuverable, very twitchy bike. But my enduro bikes have long wheelbase, and they have knobbier tires and the big full suspension with big travel in the rear, big travel in the front. And so I can bomb down hills on those enduro bikes. It's like night and day. Whereas on my hardtail, I'm not taking the big hits going down hills. I'm not doing big boulder drops and things like that. It's just not a bike that's built for that sort of thing, and I'm more likely to get myself into a little bit of trouble or create some very expensive repairs if I take it onto trails that are overly aggressive. In fact, I've pinch flatted on my hardtail, but that was my own fault because I took advice of another YouTuber and ran lower tire pressure to see if I could get better traction on the trails, and I hit a rock and I got a flat, so I don't do that anymore. But hardtails are great, you know. My Bontrager Racelight is a hardtail. I raced that for years. I loved riding it for years. And the Santa Cruz is also a hardtail, and it's a terrific ride. So a lot more of your pedal stroke is translated into pushing that bike forward as opposed to being absorbed by the suspension. And so it's a more efficient ride, but it's a different feel. And if you're into that, it's a really nice thing. And if you're on the fence, go test ride one because they're fun. You know, I wouldn't knock it. Brakes, mountain bike brakes. Now, Nick is not advocating in his video that we don't use brakes. That's not a claim that he's trying to make. Everybody needs brakes. But there's a lot of different kinds of brakes, and there's a lot of different flavors and feels that you can enjoy more over others. Now, the two big players, once again, are Shimano and SRAM. And Shimano makes a brake with a steeper response curve. What does that mean? That means that when you pull the lever, it stops you fast and hard. You hit that wall and you stop hard. And some people really like that. Can it be modulated a little bit by pulling the lever part way? Yes, a little bit. But much more so on the SRAM, where their response curve is shallower. And so when you pull that brake lever back, you get a more gradual stopping. You can squeeze it all the way and still slam on your brakes and skid all you want, but it's a more subtle response curve. And personally, that's my favorite, but a lot of people like the Shimano way of doing things as well. And there are a lot of other brake brands that lean one way or another, and a lot of them are really fantastic. But for me, the biggest difference, honestly, is the material, the fluids that they use. SRAM uses a dot fluid, which is a really nasty material. It's a really nasty stuff, and it can be corrosive, although I'm fairly sure that the dot fluid that they use on SRAM isn't corrosive, but you're not supposed to touch it with your skin, and that should tell you something. You're also not supposed to let it drip on your bike. Like, you have to wear rubber gloves, and you have to get really complicated. So Shimano uses mineral oil. In fact, a lot of brands use mineral oil, and it's fairly inert, harmless stuff. It's somewhat organic. Honestly, I don't know the impetus of mineral oil. I don't know where it comes from, so don't quote me on that, but it's a lot better for the environment than dot fluid. Dot fluid is really nasty stuff that you can't even expose to air. When you buy a jar of it, you can't leave it open, and if it's got some air in it, you're supposed to throw it away after a while if you don't use it, because exposure to the air, it absorbs gases, and it can become less potent that way. Whereas mineral oil is just oil, and you can open up the jar and close it up again and stick it on your shelf, and you're good to go. At least I'm pretty sure you are. If I'm wrong about that, leave me a note in the message in the comments below, because I'd hate to be wrong about that. But mineral oil just seems like an obvious solution. Now, I know that SRAM is coming out with one line that's going to use mineral oil. It might already be out, I'm not sure. And I don't see why they don't just switch everything over. Now, I know they have a lot of IP invested in dot fluid, and it works well for them. But mineral oil is just an obvious duh. Like, why would you not use it? So I really hope that's the future for SRAM, because I love the feel of their brakes. Their only downside is that they use that dot fluid. It's nasty stuff. The last point that Nic makes is about jumping. That's a tricky one for me, because I think jumping is super cool, and there's nothing I love more than watching a jump video. Like, it's a blast. Some of those guys do things that just blow my mind, and it's really entertaining. You know, BCPOV and a lot of other guys, they just hit this big air, and they do big drops, and they spend a lot of time off the ground, and it's a blast. You know, these guys are daredevils, and I love it. But it's not for me. And it's not because I don't want to do it. It's because I'm not a young person. And so healing is tough. You know, if I hit the ground hard, it takes me a lot longer to bounce back and be able to get back on the bike. And I have to take that into account when I go for a ride. I don't ride with anything short of knee pads, elbow pads, and a full face helmet these days. You know, am I at the point where I need a chest plate and body armor? Well, maybe not, because I'm not doing jumps, but it's a good idea to be safe. And the older you get, the longer it takes to heal. So yeah, I gotta be more careful. But God, I would love to be able to jump, because that looks like a lot of fun, you know? Jeez. When you're a jumper, I feel like it's not a matter of if, but when will you crash. And when you crash on a jump, you hit the ground harder and differently than you would if you were just riding a dirt trail. So you're more likely to hurt yourself, and that injury, at least for me, is going to take a lot longer to come back from. So that's a big fat NO. I'm out. But like I said before, it makes me sad, because I bet it's really fun. So that's my 2 cents on what Nic had to say. He made a lot of really good points. I think you should go over and watch his video. It's really good, and it's an interesting watch. And you know, give him an upvote and give him some comments down below. And I'd like to know how you feel about the stuff that I just said. Leave me some comments as well. And you know, an upvote couldn't hurt, I suppose. But thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. And I'll see you out there. Take it easy.